I never thought my job at a maternity hospital would turn into the setting of the most surreal, nerve-wracking chapter of my life. I was not a delivery doctor. I did not hold newborns in my hands or announce to glowing parents that it was a boy or a girl. My role was much more administrative. I handled intake paperwork, answered questions from nervous first-timers, walked expecting mothers through birthing plans, and gave out postnatal consultation appointments. It was a job I had grown to love, structured, calm, full of quiet routines and comforting rituals. I worked in a hospital on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, not far from Forsyth Park, where magnolias bloom in the spring and exhausted nurses walk on their lunch breaks just to breathe. Nothing about my job ever suggested that one day I would be accused of stealing a baby. It was a Thursday when it happened. My colleague Marcia had called out sick, so I covered her shift at the front desk of the maternity intake unit. Everything seemed normal, maybe even boring. A few scheduled inductions, some ultrasounds, one consultation with a lactation specialist. It was the kind of day where you answer the same 20 questions in 10 different tones. I was halfway through a patient call when a woman stormed in with a baby in her arms, and a look in her eyes I still struggle to describe. It was not anger, not exactly. It was something deeper. It was desperation, tightly wound around fury. She walked right past the security desk and made a beeline for mine. Her voice was already elevated by the time she reached me. At first, I thought she was in active labor or dealing with some kind of emergency. But when I stood up to assist her, she started screaming directly at me. Not just loudly, but with words that made my blood run cold. She said I had switched her child. She pointed at the baby in her arms, maybe 5 months old, wearing a mint green onesie and thick curls of dark brown hair, and said this child was not hers. She shouted that her real baby had been taken away and that we had handed her someone else's child instead. She accused the hospital of trading babies. At first, I was so stunned that I could barely speak. I tried to gently de-escalate her tone, motioning toward a bench in the hallway and asking if she would sit down with me so we could talk through this. I promised her we would look into it thoroughly and figure out what was going on. That calmed her for a moment. She sat. She looked at me with eyes full of raw disbelief and exhaustion and said that from the moment she brought the baby home, she felt something was off. The child's skin tone, she said, was one shade darker than hers and her husband's. The way the baby cried, the way she looked around the room, none of it matched what she had imagined from the baby she had carried. She said her husband noticed it first, that he had made an offhand joke about their daughter not being his, and ever since, she had spiraled into a conviction that this baby was not theirs at all, that somehow, during the chaos of labor and discharge, they had been handed the wrong child. I told her as gently as I could that a baby's behavior cannot be predicted, that newborns are just beginning to experience the world, and that skin tone can develop and shift in the early weeks of life. I explained our protocols, how strict we were with wristbands and identification codes, that every baby and mother were tagged and matched multiple times before leaving the hospital. I even offered to look through her discharge documents if she had them, but she would not be calmed. Her voice rose again, accusing me, the hospital, the nurses, the system. She said we had taken a child from her womb and replaced it with someone else's. She said she knew for a fact that the baby in her arms was not her daughter, and that we had dumped someone else's problem child on her. That phrase still echoes in my memory. Problem child, because the baby was calm, cooing gently, not even crying, as its mother accused us of theft. I stood up and immediately called the clinic director. His name was Dr. Milton Gardner, a calm, rational man who had worked at this facility for nearly 2 decades. When he arrived minutes later, I had already escorted the woman to a private room to avoid disturbing other patients. She repeated her accusations, more heated now, and even tried to involve another nurse who passed by. Dr. Gardner listened carefully, maintaining professional composure, and explained to her, firmly but respectfully, that unless she had proof of identity mismatch, these accusations could not be taken seriously. He told her that without medical or legal evidence, there was no basis for her claims. She stood up, clutched the baby to her chest, and said that if we were not going to fix it, she would. She promised she would not stop until she found the truth, and that everyone involved would pay. Her tone was no longer panicked. It was chillingly calm. She left, without another word. I remember turning to Dr. Gardner after she walked out and seeing the same unease in his face that I felt in my chest. He shook his head, said she had probably read some nonsense online, and that these kinds of delusions were not uncommon with postpartum complications. We noted the incident, marked it in her chart, and resumed our day. Other patients came and went. Births happened. Life continued. But in the back of my mind, I could not shake the encounter. There was something in her tone, something in the way she said it was not over, that felt like a warning. The kind you only understand in hindsight. Still, none of us could have imagined what would happen next. We had seen all kinds of drama in maternity, emotional breakouts, paternity disputes, custody crises. But this was different. This felt like something that would dig deeper than any of us were prepared for. And so we went back to work. I picked up the next call. Dr. Gardner went to his office. The nurses returned to their rounds. The hospital hummed with the usual rhythms of life. No one knew that we had just stepped into something far more complicated than anything the training manuals had prepared us for. And at that point, we still believed it would all blow over. We had no idea it was just the beginning. Update 1. I thought the incident with the woman and the baby was behind us. For a few days, it became one of those strange stories we told in the break room between back-to-back appointments. The kind of surreal encounter that shook us in the moment, but slowly faded under the weight of everyday work. Life at the maternity hospital returned to its rhythms. New patients arrived, chart updates piled up, and I picked up extra shifts to cover for a nurse going on leave. No one brought it up again. Not the nurses, not the director, not even the reception staff, who usually gossiped about everything that passed through our automatic doors. I thought the story was over. I truly believed the woman would either realize she was mistaken or quietly fade into the sea of postpartum confusion. I was wrong. So wrong. Exactly 1 week later, just after sunrise, on a foggy Friday morning, I opened my apartment door in Midtown Savannah to get the mail and saw flashing lights reflecting off every window in the building. I had not even processed what I was seeing before I heard the unmistakable thunder of boots slamming down the hallway. My heart punched the inside of my chest like it was trying to escape. Two uniformed officers shouted my name and told me to stand back. They moved with trained efficiency, stepping inside as if they already knew the layout of my place. I backed away with my hands up, completely stunned, stammering out something about being a hospital employee, not a criminal. They checked my ID, made a call on their radios, and told me I was not under arrest. Not yet. It made no sense. They informed me they were executing a warrant tied to an ongoing investigation. The word investigation sank into my stomach like lead. They did not explain much else, just that I was being temporarily suspended from all duties at the maternity center, and that I would be required to cooperate fully if contacted by authorities again. Then they left, like a summer storm that shreds your roof and disappears into a blue sky as if nothing ever happened. My hands shook as I tried to dial someone. Anyone. I started with my supervisor, but got no answer. I called the main hospital number, but the line looped into a dead tone. I opened my laptop and checked my work email, which had been deactivated. When I switched over to my personal inbox, a message was already waiting for me. It was from the hospital's Emergency Communications Department. The subject line was plain and chilling. Immediate facility suspension notice. Legal matter pending. The email informed me that the Savannah Maternity and Women's Health Center had been temporarily closed, effective immediately. All services were suspended pending the results of an ongoing legal inquiry. It added that no employees were to access the building or attempt to contact patients until further notice. The email ended with a list of legal resources and a vague reassurance that updates would be provided once more information became available. That was it. No explanation, no reason, just silence and shutdown. I could not believe it. This was the same hospital that had delivered thousands of babies, the same building where I'd spent the last 4 years building a routine, a purpose, a life. And now, just like that, it was closed, frozen in legal limbo. I kept rereading the email, expecting a paragraph to appear that would explain why, but it never came. I turned on the local news, and that is when the real shock hit me. There it was, running as a special bulletin on the bottom of the screen. Savannah Maternity Center under investigation after mother alleges baby switch at birth. They had filmed from across the street. The camera zoomed in on crime scene tape and the front doors that I had walked through every morning before sunrise. The anchor's voice reported that the hospital was under formal federal investigation for alleged mishandling of birth identification protocols. They said an unnamed mother had filed a complaint claiming her baby had been switched at birth and that the case had escalated rapidly after she presented what she claimed was DNA evidence contradicting the hospital's records. I sat frozen, hand covering my mouth, as they showed images of police carrying boxes of records out of the hospital's admin wing. But the worst part came next. They said the director, Dr. Milton Gardner, had been taken into custody the night before for questioning and would remain under investigation pending potential charges related to negligence and document tampering. My breath caught in my throat. Dr. Gardner? That man was calm to the point of being boring. He followed protocols like scripture and treated everyone with the same unshakable, measured kindness. There was no version of reality where I could see him engaging in anything even remotely dishonest. And yet, there his name was, attached to headlines that sounded like the plot of a conspiracy film. I stared at the screen, numb. I thought of the woman who had screamed at me just 1 week earlier, the way she had said she would not stop, how she promised we would all pay. At the time, her words felt unhinged, like the lashing out of someone under extreme emotional pressure. Now I realized she had already been moving forward with something far more serious than just accusations. She had filed a formal case. She had brought in lawyers. She had found a way to make her story real enough to spark a full-blown federal investigation. And while I sat in my apartment, trying to figure out whether I was going to be arrested or fired, she had somehow turned the whole maternity hospital into ground zero of one of the biggest scandals our state had ever seen. I could not call my coworkers. No one was answering. I tried texting a few of the nurses I was closest to, and all I got back were variations of "What is happening? Are you okay? I am scared." And they came to my house too. We were all trapped in the same confusion. None of us had answers. None of us knew what exactly we were being accused of. The one person who might have had answers, Dr. Gardner, was sitting in a cell or an interrogation room somewhere. The silence was worse than anything else. I stayed inside the rest of the day, too afraid to go out, too overwhelmed to eat. I paced the floor, looking at old schedules, old documents, anything that might give me some sense of control or understanding. But nothing made sense. Nothing explained how a single accusation could lead to a hospital being raided, staff being interrogated, and reputations being obliterated in less than 7 days. I kept asking myself what had gone so wrong. I had not touched a baby. I had not recorded anything improperly. I had not even worked the day the woman had delivered. My only involvement was listening to her speak. And now my career was on pause, my reputation hanging by a thread, and the life I had spent years building inside those maternity ward walls was collapsing around me. By the time the sun set, I had gone from disbelief to exhaustion. I sank into the couch, phone still in hand, the news playing in the background, repeating the same few bullet points like a looped nightmare. There were no new updates, just more speculation, more silence from hospital leadership, more panic in our group chat, more fear from everyone who wore a badge with our hospital's logo on it. I did not understand what was happening. None of us did. We were suspended, frozen in place, watching something monstrous take shape from shadows we did not even know existed. Update 2. The summons came 3 weeks after the hospital was shut down, delivered in a thick white envelope that felt far heavier than paper should. By that point, my nerves were already shredded, but seeing my name printed alongside legal language made my hands go numb. I was officially ordered to appear in court as a person potentially responsible for negligence, because on the day the woman came in screaming with the child, I had been on shift. According to the complaint, my role at the intake desk meant I was part of the system that had allegedly handed her the wrong baby. Reading that sentence felt unreal, like someone had pasted my name into a story that belonged to another universe entirely. The weeks leading up to the hearing were a blur of anxiety. I replayed that day in my head endlessly, every detail etched into my memory. I had not handled the child. I had not accessed delivery records. I had done exactly what my job description required, and nothing more. Still, The idea that I could be legally responsible for something so impossible made me feel physically sick. I barely slept, barely ate, and spent most nights staring at my ceiling in the dark, imagining worst-case scenarios I had no power to stop. When the court date arrived, I walked into the courthouse in downtown Savannah, feeling like I was walking into an alternate version of my life. The building was cold and imposing, its stone columns towering overhead, and everything echoed. Footsteps, murmurs, the distant shuffle of paperwork. I saw Dr. Gardner sitting a few rows ahead of me. He looked older than I remembered, like the stress had carved years into his face in a matter of weeks. We exchanged a glance that carried equal parts disbelief and silent support. Neither of us understood how we had ended up there. The prosecution laid out their case in a way that made my stomach turn. They framed the hospital as careless, disorganized, and dismissive of a mother's concerns. My name came up repeatedly, tied to the moment the woman first raised the alarm. They said I failed to escalate her complaint appropriately. They implied that my calm response was indifference. Sitting there, listening to my professionalism twisted into negligence, I felt a mix of anger and helplessness I had never known before. I knew it was slander. I knew I had followed protocol, and yet the words still landed like blows. Then they introduced what they called new evidence. A DNA test had been conducted at a private hospital in Atlanta after the woman refused to accept the initial dismissal of her claims. According to the results, the child in her care showed only a 1% genetic similarity to both her and her husband. 1%. The number echoed through the courtroom, and I felt the air leave my lungs. That was not a clerical error. That was not a misunderstanding. That was biologically impossible if the child were theirs. I remember looking at Dr. Gardner, expecting to see disbelief, but what I saw instead was shock so deep it bordered on devastation. He shook his head slowly, like he was trying to wake himself from a nightmare. Up until that moment, I had clung to the belief that this entire case was fueled by delusion or manipulation. That belief shattered right there. The room felt tense, like everyone was holding their breath. The judge ordered a recess, and when we returned, the atmosphere had shifted completely. This was no longer a question of hysteria or false accusation. Something had gone terribly wrong. Then they called in the obstetrician who had delivered the baby. She was someone everyone trusted. A senior doctor with an impeccable reputation, decades of experience, and a demeanor that always radiated confidence and competence. I had worked alongside her countless times, watched nurses defer to her judgment without hesitation. Seeing her walk into the courtroom felt surreal, like seeing a familiar figure suddenly out of place. I still believed she would clear everything up. I thought she would explain how the test was flawed or how records had been misinterpreted. Instead, she confessed. She admitted that on the night of the delivery, there had been complications. Another infant had been born around the same time, and due to a series of personal decisions she claimed were driven by panic and exhaustion, she had deliberately switched the babies. She said she thought one child had a better chance with different parents. She said she intended to fix it later. She said it spiraled out of control. I felt like the floor dropped out from under me. My ears rang, and for a moment, I could not even process the words. This was not negligence. This was intentional. This was criminal. I looked at Dr. Gardner again, and his face had gone pale. He stared straight ahead, completely frozen like his mind had short-circuited. This was someone he had trusted with lives, with ethics, with the very foundation of the hospital's integrity. And now, in a matter of minutes, everything he had built was unraveling because of her actions. The courtroom erupted into chaos, but I barely registered it. All I could think about was that woman who had stood in front of me weeks earlier, screaming, dismissed as irrational, treated like a nuisance. She had been right. And all of us, without knowing it, had been standing on the wrong side of the truth. As the reality of the confession settled in, the weight of it crushed me. The anger, the fear, the confusion, all blended into one overwhelming sense of shock. I was not guilty, but that knowledge did not bring relief. It brought a new kind of horror. The realization that the system I believed in, the people I trusted, had failed in the most unthinkable way. When the hearing adjourned for the day, I walked out alongside Dr. Gardner. In silence. Neither of us knew what to say. The confession hung between us, heavy and irreversible. Everything we thought we understood about our work, our hospital, and our roles within it had been shattered in a single moment. And as I stepped back into the sunlight outside the courthouse, I felt completely untethered, struggling to comprehend how trust could collapse so thoroughly, and how the truth, when it finally surfaced, could be so much more devastating than any accusation. Update 3. The trial ended the way none of us wanted, but all of us silently expected after the confession. We lost. Not because we were all guilty, but because the system we worked in had allowed someone with absolute authority to make an irreversible decision with no oversight. The court ruled in favor of the woman who had come to us in tears and rage, and for the first time since all this had begun, I saw her not as a force of chaos, but as a mother who had been right all along. The hospital was spared from permanent closure, but that was only because the doctor who had orchestrated everything pled guilty. Her admission of guilt shifted the blame solely onto her, and that narrow line saved the rest of us from going down with her. The hospital would reopen, but not without scars. Its name was dragged through every local news segment, and trust would take years to rebuild. The worst part came during the sentencing phase, when more details surfaced about the motive behind it all. The doctor, someone we had all respected, someone we had shared coffee with and trusted with our patients, had not made an impulsive decision. She had been paid. A wealthy couple, desperate for a healthy child, had offered her a substantial sum to ensure they were given a baby without any genetic complications. And the baby that the woman gave birth to, the one she had cried over, panicked about, and ultimately rejected, had been born with a series of early-stage health conditions, treatable but not perfect. And for that reason alone, he had been given away to someone else without his mother ever knowing. It was human trafficking under the disguise of medicine. When I heard that, something in me broke. All the confusion, all the dread, all the disbelief collapsed into something heavier. Grief. Grief for the mother who had been made to feel insane. Grief for the baby whose life had started with a lie. Grief for the hospital that had once felt like a sanctuary, but had been rotting quietly under the surface. And most of all, grief for the trust I had placed in people who never deserved it. The doctor was sentenced to 20 years in prison. No parole for the first 10. She left the courtroom in handcuffs. Her once perfect composure shattered into shame and silence. There were no words left to say. The damage had been done. In the months that followed, the hospital underwent a massive transformation. Dr. Gardner, still stunned but determined, implemented a new position within the maternity department. A permanent, independent oversight officer would now be assigned to every shift involving childbirth, postnatal care, and patient discharge. Their only job would be to verify, document, and confirm every identification match independently from medical staff. Redundancy, he said, was now a requirement. No one would ever have the chance to do what she did again. I went back to work eventually, but I was not the same. None of us were. The building looked the same. The walls were still painted in soft pastels, and the halls still echoed with the cries of newborns. But beneath it all was the weight of what had happened. We had all learned the cost of silence, of assumptions, of placing too much power in one person's hands. And the woman who had started it all, the one we had dismissed, doubted, and quietly judged, was the one who reminded us what accountability looked like. I still see her sometimes, walking through Forsyth Park with her daughter. The same daughter who had once been a stranger to her, but was now unmistakably hers. They laugh. They run. They are whole. And even though I had no hand in fixing what happened, a small part of me clings to the fact that she never gave up. She was right. And her truth changed everything.